first ever 12-team college football playoff is set, and you can join me, David Ubben.
And me, two-time national champion of Alabama, Damian Harris.
And me, Chris Vanini, two-time national champion in the College Football 25 video game.
On Until Saturday, the Athletics College Football Podcast for all the playoff previews, predictions, coaching carousel, and transfer portal news 4 times a week throughout the CFP. Dame, how do you think Bama's going to do in the playoffs?
Shut up, David. Listen, the Tide may be out of the playoffs, but I'm super excited to see the 12 best teams in the nation play.
All the banter, insights, and more on Until Saturday. Subscribe on Apple, Spotify, or wherever you listen to podcasts.
The Athletic.
At the Race MotoGP podcast, we are quite fond of making predictions, especially lairy ones. Some of them come true, some of them are phenomenally lucky prophecies, some of them turn out to be nonsense within about 10 minutes of us saying them. And during 2024, I've repeatedly promised that we'll revisit the predictions this year, hold ourselves to account, and take note of the times we got it spot on and the times we did whatever the opposite of spot on is. I'm Matt Beer. With me are Simon Patterson, Val Khorounzhiy, and a special guest, Lewis Duncan from Crash.net, who joined us for a couple of cameo appearances in the summer. And one of those was a Larry Predictions episode in which he properly lived up to the title. So we thought if we're going to be mocking ourselves for all the things we got right and wrong, Lewis has to come back for that one. Thank you very much, Crash, for letting us borrow him for this Christmas appearance. Lewis, you can go first with the opening question. Can you remember anything of what you predicted when you were with us and how wise or not it was?
I think I said that Martin's title challenge would crumble after the summer break, and obviously that proved to be incorrect. But to be fair, I have to hold my hands up to that one because I did not expect the campaign that Martin put in, to be honest, in the second half of the season. I'm very happy to be proven wrong by that.
That one might be thrown in your face a bit later. Simon and Val, can you remember anything you got spectacularly right or wrong over the last 12 months?
I can't remember the last podcast we did, let alone we did over the summer break.
Listeners as well, especially because we recorded the last podcast literally 6 hours ago due to Christmas recording schedules. So.
I didn't want to say that for the sake of continuity, but I'm even struggling to go that far back. A lot has happened since then. It's been a long day.
I can remember all the stuff I got right and some of the stuff I got wrong, but I'm not going to bring up the stuff I got wrong in case you didn't find it. And it's just lost to history.
That's a really smug answer, Val. It's like, I know what I did right.
We're going to start by looking at our prediction for how the championship itself would turn out. After pre-season testing, I got you two, me, and our boss, Glenn Freeman, to predict the championship top 10 order. The contentious part of this was right at the start. Pedro Acosta, we put 10th. Obviously, that turned out to be a massive undersell. However, me and Glenn were outraged that whereas we both put Acosta in our top 10, based on reading the punditry of some people called Simon Patterson and Val Khorounzhiy, who were really big on Acosta, well, you two we went for him in the top 10 as a definite star of the season. You two didn't include him at all in your top 10s. Now we're going to listen to Simon's justification for why Acosta was not going to be in the championship top 10.
I still think he's going to have a phenomenally good season. And I think we're going to see him right at the sharp end of races that he probably has no business being at the sharp end of towards the end of the season. But I think it's completely unrealistic to expect him to be there from day one. And you forget, until I sat down and started to put together this top 10, you forget just how incredibly stacked MotoGP is right now. And Acosta, while I think he is a future multiple world champion in the Premier class, he's on arguably the third best bike on the grid right now. He's up against 8 absolutely dominant Ducatis, and most of their riders you expect are going to be winning races this season. So it's not a reflection on him that he's not on my top 10. It's a reflection on just how stacked the rest of the grid is, that I think that he's not going to have the consistency in year one to be top 10 in the championship.
Simon, now you've heard that, it wasn't as outrageous as going, no, I just don't think this kid's any good, but that your argument didn't actually hold up in the end.
Much like the 4 Ducati riders who finished behind Pedro Acosta in the championship standings, my prediction was sabotaged by Michelin's new rear tyre. Because there shouldn't have been 4 Ducatis behind him. The GP23s basically shouldn't have been as awful as they were, but they were really awful. And I think apart from that, the rest of my prediction stands. He was at the sharp end of races that he had no business being at the sharp end of. Like I said, he crashed his brains out, which I kind of expected, even though I didn't say it in that. But the others were distinctly worse than I expected them to be. And I think really that's why, that's why he was further up in the standings, even though he had basically the season I predicted him having.
Lewis, does Simon's argument hold water there? And what were you thinking about Acosta this time 9.5 months ago before he'd actually raced a MotoGP bike? If you'd been on that podcast, would you have thought these two were mental for not putting him top 10?
Yeah, I would have disagreed with him not being in the top 10. I didn't buy into the sort of hype that he was going to fight for the championship, but I kind of thought he could at least maybe win a race. And obviously kind of Japan was we sort of almost saw him do that. Or he certainly had, that was kind of the race he had the pace to do it. I think Simon's spot on, to be fair. The rear tyre had a much bigger impact on things than we did. I also sort of disagree that we have such a super stacked grid, but that's maybe because I have exceedingly high standards for everyone. So there's a lot of riders on that grid that I don't consider to be anywhere near good enough to be in the top 10, but that's probably a podcast for another day. But I think if I was going to predict as to where Pedro was going to end up, it probably would have been roughly about where he ended up anyway, kind of basing that on what Quartararo did in 2019 and a kind of substantially different kind of era of MotoGP. But yeah, I see both sides of that argument.
It is worth saying, actually, while we're in this kind of range of who underperformed versus who didn't. We also predicted what percentage of the races Ducati would win. Val, at that point, said 65%, and Simon went for 80% and suggested Marc Marquez alone could win 65%. The actual tally was 90% of all the races across Grand Prix and sprints were won by Ducatis, and they were not as well shared out as Ducati's victories have been in previous years either. They were very concentrated on those main three protagonists and Enea Bastianini. So you look at it that way, there's a potential massive amount of underperformance among people who, when you were saying Acosta might be squeezed out of the top 10, there's an awful lot of people who just didn't, not about Acosta doing better than you guys expected necessarily, Val, it's about a lot of people in front of him just not living up to your hopes.
Yeah, kind of, but you know what, when you say that, those are two incongruous ideas to hold. For me, the absence of Acosta from the top 10 was by and large because I didn't think the KTM ceiling was as high as he showed it to be, and I thought the year-old Ducatis would have performed better. But then, if I thought that, then where did I get all those non-Ducati winners from? I mean, the only explanation is Aprilia racking up the wins, I guess. I'd like to ask...
Your famous massive faith in Yamaha.
Yeah, I'd like to ask Val from a year ago what he was trying to accomplish there by putting forward that idea of a MotoGP season. But I suspect his answer would have been very simple. I forgot.
Well, also, it's traditional in predictions episodes, Val, re-listening to all of them over the last few weeks. Almost every prediction you make within 10 minutes, you'll go, what? Did I mean that? Sometimes you get to the end of the sentence and you're kind of questioning your logic from 10 seconds earlier, which is why when I mentioned revisiting predictions, you just kind of rolled your eyes at me and said you love a predictions episode with Slight Menace a few weeks ago when we were planning what to do. We only got 2 of our top 10 right in this count when we did this countdown. So let's just go through, before we get to the top of the list, which we also got wrong, let's go through some of our high and low lights from the bottom. So Acosta 10th, Maverick Vinales 9th, where did he end up? 7th in the end? I find his positions very hard to memorize because they always bear no relation to 90% of what he's actually done all season. Maverick Vinales 9th, hands up for me, I didn't think he'd be in the top 10, so I was the outlier there and the massive skeptic, and then probably thanks to Cota alone, I was wrong. Simon, you suggested Raul Fernandez would be 9th because you were obviously having dinner with Massimo Rivola when you made your list. Fernandez, where did he even end up? 16th. Can you remember what... I mean, I know, having re-listened, but can you remember what you were thinking to put Raul Fernandez as high as 9th?
No.
It was largely based on the fact the testing had gone kind of okay, and particularly his first contact with the new bike had gone okay.
Yeah, is testing had gone well, and actually, I think he would have been much higher than 16th, maybe not as high as 9th in the final standings if they hadn't switched him to the GP24 halfway through the season, because as it turned out, it was probably a worse bike. I'm going to be able to blame Michelin's new rear tyre for everything in this episode, aren't I? It didn't work as well with the new rear tyre, and he basically had to unlearn the bike he was riding and start over again halfway through the season. I think if he, whenever you look at the kind of the trend line of his results, there was more than 16th if they'd kept him on the old bike. However, with everyone leaving Aprilia apart from him, it was the only thing they could have done kind of going forward. They had to put him on the 24 to have him up to speed going into this season as the sole remaining guy. So long term, not a terrible idea, but I think it probably hamstrung his year from that point on.
In 8th, we collectively put Fabio Di Gianantonio, who, again, me being the skeptic, who did I even put in the top 10? Because I binned Digia out of the top 10 as well. My logic being that the end of 2023 was potentially a flash in the pan and not enough evidence. Obviously, that was wrong again. 7th, collectively, was Aleix Espargaro. Val thought he'd be as high as 6th. I don't think any of us reckoned on him kind of actively retiring from racing while still racing for a portion of the season, which is also the portion of the season that the Aprilia just was falling apart. And then Marco Bezzecchi, we put 6th. Now this was a really interesting one because we were really positive about how good Bezzecchi would still be. We just felt the goalposts were moving around him with stronger lineups emerging elsewhere. So we were like, I can't believe we're putting him as low as 6th in that particular predictions episode. We didn't expect him to be off the pace himself. Val?
So yeah, there's two things going on here, and they're both very unfortunate. They show why this can bite you in so many different ways. I think putting Aleix 6th was me going, well, preseason shows he's figured out the new Aprilia better than everybody else, and he will obviously make hay on that. Putting Bezzecchi as high as I did, and as high as we all did, was, well, the preseason, that can't be true. That just can't be true. So we'll go back to the bigger sample size of 2023, and he'll at least be competitive. And in fact, he
never figured out the rear tire with the bike. At no point in the season was it really truly working, apart from the tracks where Marco Bezzecchi can overcome that. But the performance trend was never good. So, I mean, if he saw that at that moment of the preseason already, he didn't sound depressed enough maybe to give it away. Although I do think he already sounded worried at that point. Maybe we should have heeded the warning a bit more.
Lewis, was your impression of Bez as the season went on that he was just fundamentally hamstrung by a tyre that didn't suit him and there wasn't a lot he could do about it? Or actually, should he have found more of a way around this if he really is as top level a rider as he had appeared in 2023?
I would have said yes if it hadn't been for the fact that his teammate proved that you can be competitive on the GP23, and also by not being Marc Marquez either, because, you know, I think that's an important distinction, was that Marc is Marc. He overrides anything. If he was in a shopping trolley, he would have won those 3 Grand Prix he won. That's just what Marc does. The fact that Digia was so consistently good over the year, and also, you know, had the same bike progression as Bez did as well. This is one like Bez went backwards a step. He's followed Digia from the GP22 to the GP23. So yes, you can argue, okay, the riding style thing on that bike, same problems as Bastianini had the year before, but there does come a point where you kind of have to figure it out, regardless of the technical limitations. You just have to figure it out. And I think the fact that he still finished behind his teammate who missed the last 2 races, plus another one through injury, kind of, I think, speaks to possibly Bez maybe not being quite as strong a rider in the MotoGP class as maybe his results from the previous year would have suggested. I know a lot of people really, really rate Bez. I'm not so sure on that anymore, really. You know, I think his 24 was very much like Bastianini's 23, and Bastianini's then 24 wasn't brilliant. I know Bez has gone to a new bike, but I kind of think next year we're going to see probably the true reflection of where Bez is in the MotoGP pecking order, and I don't think it's going to be as high up as a lot of people back him to be.
But wouldn't you agree that, for instance, Bezzecchi could have been as good as he looked in 2023 and as bad as he looked in 2024 at the same time? Because it's not just about... There's no such thing as just a level of performance out of 100, right? So we're talking about specific circumstances, specific bands of performance, levels of grip. I mean, I always go back to, Dovizioso turned from a title contender into barely hanging on overnight when they changed the rear tire. It's adaptability, which is very valuable and very important, but it doesn't need to mean that 23 was a mirage so much as 2023 represented a MotoGP that doesn't exist anymore. And of course, it is up to Bezzecchi to figure that out, but that doesn't mean he wasn't as good in 23 for 23 as he looked in 23, is what I'm trying to say.
Yeah, I can see where you're coming from. I think there's other factors at play here as well, as the fact that obviously the Japanese manufacturers have been rubbish for the past few years, and therefore you've wiped off last year, for example, you wiped Fabio off the board, you wiped the Honda riders off the board, and there were a lot of good Honda riders there, and it's kind of the same this year. And I think this is the other thing as well with trying to predict how everyone's going to do is you've got these quite major riders like Quartararo, who are on bikes that we just really don't know what's going to turn up from week to week. It'll either be rubbish or it could all of a sudden be at the front of the field. So I think there's that as well. I think it's an unfortunate. Bez has landed on his feet for next year. He's got a factory contract. He's probably inherited what is now going to be the second best bike, with KTM's ongoing problems set to probably really dog them next year, if there is a next year. I just don't know. I feel like Bez is one of these guys that he's quick. There's no doubt about that. But in this day and age, being quick on a Ducati kind of is sort of. There's no excuse not to be. Again, for me, the fact that his teammate was same step of bike, same, from year to year, and was just consistently better, just understood things better. Bez has to look at that and go, okay, yes, I had problems, but I got to figure it out as well. There's only so much you can do from a technical side before you just have to start making the difference yourself. And that's what these guys are paid the big money to do. That's why they're here. They got to do that themselves and figure it out themselves.
Yeah, adaptability is absolutely the right word. It's not about a talent level changing and 2023 being a mirage. It's just, at Val, you often talk about how a rider's level of talent is kind of static, and it's what everything else that moves around them, and it's how much they actually access of that talent. And with the lack of adaptability, you're not exploiting your full talent if the situation is not quite right for you, and that seemed to be where Bez was this year. The two people we got right in our top 10 were 5th and 4th. We put Brad Binder 5th. Bonus points to Val. In the summer, he predicted that Binder would still be ahead of Acosta in the championship when we did the predictions episode mid-season in August. Us three just went, what? A little bit to that. I mean, Acosta was only 2 points ahead at that point. It wasn't like it was a huge swing for Binder to overcome, but the kind of momentum was so much with Acosta rather than Binder at that point, and yet Binder did come out ahead. The other one we got right was Bastianini in 4th. Simon predicted before we averaged it all out that Bastianini would be 2nd in the championship, a massive leap from 15th, even with the injury absences, 15th to 2nd in 1 year, but 4th was where we all brought him down to. So there's two we got right. However, above that, it got a little bit sticky again. We were a little bit too harsh on the world champion. Our boss, Glenn Freeman, was one of the worst offenders for this. He is not on this episode tonight, but he has sent us a little response. But first, let's hear Glenn's argument for why Jorge Martin had blown his title shot for good in 2023.
I kind of hope I'm wrong, but I think last year was his on a Pramac shot. I think that the stars aligned as best as they ever will. And as I said at the end of last year, I think he and the team conspired to throw it away. I think it's annoying because I want Simon's satellite thing to be proven wrong. And last year was the chance. The satellite probably should have won the title last year. And I know Simon would then gone, oh no, the satellite didn't win it. The factory lost it. And I'd say, no, the satellite won it because in the end, the satellite team and its rider did lose it, which means it was theirs to lose. But anyway, that's a side argument. I just think we're now at the point where Jorge Martin is a top MotoGP rider.
Yeah.
But I think his chance to get a championship in this situation was last year, because looking at the two riders who obviously are above him in our combined top 10, either Bagnaia is not going to leave the door open in the way that he did, or maybe his Barcelona crash did last year, and will just now be a relentless best bike championship winning machine for the at least short-term future, or Marc Marquez is going to do absolute crazy things now he's back on a remotely good bike. So I just think the chances, it's one of those two, as we'll come to in a moment. At least one of them is going to do a better job than him, and he'll be good. He'll win races. He'll win lots of sprints. It's not going to be enough. I think his title shot with Pramac has gone.
So I did wave this opinion at Glenn, who has provided a response as he is not here tonight. It's actually, bless him, he sent it with a file name, Glenn is wrong.
When I first heard the inaccurate prediction I was now going to have to defend, I was pretty horrified, actually, because I felt bad for Martin that I would say that, and I was wondering what my logic was. But having heard it back in full, and I'm sure you guys haven't heard it back in full, because I know what Matt's like. He'll be playing the worst bits of all the predictions to make this episode as lairy as possible. I'm kind of comfortable with where I was coming from, which was that I didn't expect Bagnaia to open the door again by making too many mistakes in 2024, which he did. And I didn't expect Marc Marquez to be at such a machinery disadvantage on a year-old Ducati. So I'm quite comfortable with how I ended up there. I'm delighted that I was wrong because, as I said in the clip at the time, I really felt that Martin had emerged now as a legit MotoGP frontrunner, and he really did prove that to be the case. And as I said in that episode at the time, I really wanted someone to prove Simon wrong, that satellite riders can win championships. And as we all know, and as many of you know because you've bought the T-shirts on the race shop, that is indeed the case now. So I'm very happy to be proven wrong. Thank you, Jorge.
Val is desperate to come in, but before Val does, let's also damn Lewis on this front. So when Lewis appeared in the summer, admittedly just after Jorge Martin had his Saxon Ring last gasp crash, this was Lewis's very first prediction of his possibly Race MotoGP podcast debut, actually.
I think Jorge Martin's title challenge is going to go right down the toilet for a couple of reasons. One of them being that Pecco Bagnaia has just been on such fine form, and the other one is that with his impending Aprilia departure, I think we're now going to start to see the effects of Ducati removing its kind of full support for Martin and that Pramac team, you know, as the rest of the season goes on. I think it's, you know, I think that's the way it's going to go. They can't allow Martin to take the number one plate to Aprilia. Yeah, especially given they, you know, shunned him for Marc Marquez. So, there's a lot of face saving that's going to have to go on. So, yeah, I think Martin's challenge for the championship is going to get increasingly further away.
So, Glenn and Lewis were emphatically wrong there. But again, as with so many of these predictions, wrong for a reason that made sense. Val, you were always the one out of all of us who was most adamant Ducati would not screw Jorge Martin over and would be keen to prove its fairness by letting him take the title fight to the wire. You are, not for the first time this season, vindicated.
Kind of. Not really. I also did put him third, like Glenn did in the end of season predictions. I mean, he mentions me getting tied in knots, and if I remember correctly, it was because I put him third and then followed it up by saying, what am I doing? He's going to win the championship. Which
yes.
is an all-timer hedging of the bets. Which
it's a very Val thing to happen.
Yeah, but I don't get much credit for that. What I would say is, for the start of the season, the way Glenn felt, we've now kind of found out that Jorge Martin felt. Jorge Martin has been speaking about his, championship recently, and he spoke to the official MotoGP website, and he said that at the start of 2024, he was in no mind space to go race, to go win. He was just showing up to work, getting paid. And clearly the reason to do that is if you've looked at 2023 and you've gone, there was an open goal here that wasn't supposed to be here. Pecco got himself hurt in Spain. He left the door open for me to win a championship that wasn't really on. I didn't win it. I lost it. And I'm not 100% sure I'll get the chance again. And as good as Jorge Martin has been in MotoGP and had been in MotoGP up until that year, that was, I think, a very, very reasonable way to look at it. Once he did start the season the way he did it, once it became more obvious to me that sort of the Martin who can consistently at least bother Bagnaia, sometimes beat Bagnaia on not just Saturdays but Sundays, that he was here to stay, that part of his, that he was still progressing, still improving, because obviously his MotoGP career started later than Bagnaia's. Once it became, I started to believe that was here to stay, then I started to believe in his championship challenge. Not necessarily prevailing, but at least, going the distance. And I genuinely, I know this sounds arrogant. It's easy to say in hindsight. I almost never doubted that Ducati wasn't going to stop him from winning it. Genuinely.
Our objection was always just the sheer commercial logic of not wanting your number one plate to be taken away, not wanting to see your main bike defeated. We were all, Simon, me and you were both always adamant on that. How surprised were you that Ducati didn't pull some levers in whatever way? I think you wrote a column, which was probably me putting a more lairy headline on it than you intended, but oh well, that's kind of what I get paid for. It's just saying there's no way Ducati will let Martin win the championship now after he left. Was this a case of Ducati deliberately not pulling levers it could have pulled, or actually, given that the relative form of Bagnaia and Martin, was there actually nothing it could do anyway?
I mean, they could always do something. There's always something a manufacturer can do if you want to. Maybe not that we would ever even have noticed happening, but you can always do something. But I still think, maybe they should have, because, I thought it was quite funny because we're in that time of the year where we get all the team launch information start to come through, and the Aprilia team launch is before Aprilia normally don't do a team launch. Their team launch this year is in Milan, 4 days before the Ducati team launch, where they're going to be unveiling a Ducati rider, probably with a number one on the Aprilia. And they get the first crack at the headlines and everything. It almost feels like they waited to see when Ducati were doing their launch to organise theirs. Which, is good marketing, but it just, again, proves why Ducati kind of screwed up, because shouldn't have happened. It is worth noting, though, and this is important, that, essentially the reason why they lost the title, while the factory team lost the title, is still, I can't come away from it. It's that single mechanical problem in Le Mans. So in theory, they did enough to take Pecco Bagnaia to the championship, apart from that one day when they, not him, arguably didn't do enough and the bike broke down.
On pure performance, Bagnaia still had him beat over the course of the season.
By a mile.
A mile, I think, is
He won 3 times as many races.
Yeah.
He needed to. The situation him and mainly he had put himself in.
Yeah, the points he was losing, the points Martin was losing, were, solo. Bagnaia often had help. He also helped himself, but he certainly had help. So, again, in terms of pure performance, it wasn't that, drastically different to 2023, but he was close enough to where the margin of error comes in, and the margin of error fell Jorge Martin's way. I think I don't think anybody should really get any points or not points for forecasting a Martin title over a Bagnaia title, or the other way around, because it was always within the margin of error. It's betting on black and betting on red in roulette. What you should get bashed for is if you said Marc Marquez was going to win it, but I'm sure none of us did it here.
We'll get onto Marc Marquez in a little while. He comes up in a slightly different context. Lewis, if before Silverstone you were predicting Jorge Martin's title bid was going down the toilet, at which point did how can I put this into a metaphor that's not just grotesque? Did it rise back up through the toilet bowl for you, or were you all...
At what point did it get clogged?
Basically, yeah.
Yeah, I think that second Misano weekend, when Pecco was kind of having some weird tyre troubles, but then was coming back, was a safe third was there. Ultimately at the end, Bastianini took 5 points away from Martin. There was a real big damage limitation opportunity there for Pecco, and he threw it away. There was no need for him to be pushing and doing the lap times he was. Third was there for him. And, in hindsight, which again, very easy to do, if you look at the way that final lap panned out and Martin was well off track, there's an argument to be made that Pecco might well have overtaken Martin anyway with, I think for me that was the point where it kind of started to go to more towards Martin's direction. And then Indonesia, Martin crashed in that sprint race, but all weekend he had Pecco licked, and Pecco was kind of just really quite poor in the race and was really fortunate that his teammate crashed out as well to give him a few extra points. the way Martin surmounted that kind of whole stressful situation in Indonesia, as he said at the time, he had a lot of ghosts from that crash in the sprint, from the crash in Indonesia last year when he was leading. That was the point where he really put it together. And then, he was just more consistent. Yeah, Pecco was arguably the faster rider, but he kept making really unnecessary mistakes. And just going back to the argument earlier about, should Ducati have done something? If you're a manufacturer, would you rather have the guy that was more consistent winning the championship, or your main guy who's, he's won 11 races, but he's non-scored, 8 or 9 times? For me, from an image point of view, I think the latter looks quite bad, really, for the championship as a whole. So, yeah, but for Martin, that Misano to Indonesia back-to-back was really where it started to click. And then from that point onwards, you go to Japan, not a great kind of weekend there for Martin given the crash in qualifying, and yet he comes through it. He comes through it with a really good damage limitation thing, and that was really the level he just sat at through to the end of the season, so that when it got to that really tense final race, Pecco had the measure of him, but all he had to do was sit where he was, and he did that perfectly.
Val, you said a minute ago that people shouldn't really get credit for betting one way or the other on Bagnaia and Martin because it's so close. However, I'm going to give you credit because right at the start of the year, you were onto something about Pecco Bagnaia.
I think he's still going to be great. I think his strengths will still remain his strengths, his diligence, his race smart, all of that. I just don't think he'll win the title. And I think that for me will be the significantly worst portion of it. I think I didn't like the way the late season trend went last year, and I think next year is going to be harder. And I think there will be too many hurdles for him to overcome the problems that he's had this year if those problems at all resurface again. I think next year, if you want to win the championship, you can't be flirting with Q1 on Friday. I think he's going to be really good. I think this is not me to suggest that suddenly, the fraud's going to be exposed or whatever. That's ridiculous. But I don't think he'll win the title. My suspicion is it will be just harder, and that will look like a climb down.
So there you go, Val. You were Bagnaia skeptical to a degree right at the start of the year. But is it fair to say that the reasons that you end up losing the title were kind of completely different to the things you were highlighting?
Yeah, I got it. I got that one wrong because he wasn't. The Q1 third on Friday was almost never the case, and he made Q2 every single round. He was one of, I think, 3 riders to do it. The others being Jorge Martin and, if I'm not mistaken, Maverick Vinales. Of course. Had to bring that one up.
Yeah.
But
you got any stats about his position at the first corner that you could throw in as well?
Yeah, but what lost it for Bagnaia, of course, is it's the drop points and the collisions with other riders, yes, but also the starts. And I didn't necessarily see that one coming, but maybe I should have because it ended up playing quite a substantial part. But also, what did lose him to him, and I reiterate that again, is margin of error, is having somebody else be close enough to where you do not have a baked-in margin. You do not have the baked-in margin you had in 22 to defeat Fabio Quartararo, who was basically riding around in a unicycle for the second half of that season, and you don't have the baked-in margin that you used up in the Barcelona crash in 23.
I gave my brother a New York Times subscription.
She sent me a year-long subscription, so I have access to all the games. We'll do Wordle, Mini, Spelling Bee.
It has given us a personal connection.
We exchange articles, and so having read the same article, we can discuss it. The coverage, the options, not just news.
Such a diversified gift.
I was really excited to give him a New York Times cooking subscription so that we could share recipes. And we even just shared a recipe the other day.
The New York Times contributes to our quality time together.
You have all of that information at your fingertips.
It enriches our relationship, broadening our horizons.
It was such a cool and thoughtful gift.
We're reading the same stuff. We're making the same food. We're on the same page.
Connect even more with someone you care about.
Learn more about giving a New York Times subscription as a gift
at nytimes.com/gift.
Get a special rate if you act before December 26th.
We also took a very early stab at the 2025 rider market. Now, our record for this is not superb. I always think of one of the very first episodes I did as Toby Moody stand-in at the time when I got us to predict the 2023, I think, rider market, a long way ahead. And every time I think of that episode, I think of Aaron Canet on a Suzuki, which is something that has not come to pass in all sorts of ways with neither of those protagonists in MotoGP.
I think you saw a window into a better universe than the one we have right now. I quite like the idea of Aaron Canet and the Suzuki. I'm going to think about that a lot more now that you've reminded me of it.
We were 60% right, though, with our prediction for who would go where for 2025. I'm going to start by going through what I regard as our easy wins that we can't claim too much credit for. So, Pecco Bagnaia staying put at Ducati. Yeah. Pedro Acosta quickly getting promoted to Works KTM. Yep. But Brad Binder being kept alongside him. Yep. Luca Marini had an ongoing Honda contract. Alex Rins had an ongoing Yamaha contract. We thought that Franco Morbidelli would end up back at VR46, whatever happened, really. We were correct. Johan Zarco, ongoing LCR Honda contract. Alex Marquez just seems to fit at Gresini. We didn't see that changing. I don't even know what his contract is. Val?
Alex Rins actually did not have an ongoing contract for Yamaha for 25. He did have to get a renewal in, and he actually, honestly, kind of came closer to blowing that than you would have expected coming into the season.
Oh, I forgot he wasn't on a straight through.
Yeah, he was on a 1 year that then got extended to a 2 to get him in line with the usual factory deals.
One I regard as, I've listed this as an easy-ish win. We thought Raul Fernandez would stay at Trackhouse based on the general Aprilia enthusiasm for him, but I could see that one feeling dubious at times as the year went on. There's a column I've entitled "Wahey Us, We Were Right," because we got some big-ish ones correct. Fabio Quartararo staying at Yamaha did not seem that likely early in the season. Val, you suggested that wouldn't happen in your prediction, but I think the setup for this episode was you two had to make your cases and I played judge, basically, and Simon's case for Quartararo staying put despite everything was actually stronger. So, yeah, Quartararo staying put. Listeners, I go on about the Race Members Club a lot. I'm going to do it again. We have a beautiful Fabio Quartararo interview in there that went live in the last couple of days. You heard the small version on the Race MotoGP podcast main feed last week. The full version just gives you a load more depth about why he's staying put, his hopes, his whole life and career. The special that went out in the Members Club at the weekend covered all 6 Honda and Yamaha riders, really revealing interviews in full. You heard the snippets last week on the main feed. There's over an hour extra across the 6 of them in the Members Club. Come and find us on Patreon, look for The Race, or go to the-race.com/members-club to sign up on the website. We will be throwing so many more bonus pieces of content, including our revisit of the entire 2015 MotoGP season, into your ears through Patreon and the Members Club during 2025. But yes, back to 2024. We thought Yamaha would somehow keep Quartararo. Lewis, way back when Yamaha was fighting for Quartararo, which way did you see that one going?
I don't really remember, to be honest. I remember what I thought after the Misano test last year was that there was a pretty bleak future ahead of both him and Marc at the time, before obviously then Marc decided to throw a grenade into the rider market and move to Gresini. But at the time when, I remember Fabio's comment to the bike and he just wasn't very impressed, and I thought, Yamaha are going to have a tough time keeping hold of him. But on the flip side, where does he go? He's a big name rider. He's a big, he was a big free agent on the market. But you look at, Ducati not going to be spending money on big names, really. KTM didn't really seem like an option. He wasn't going to go to another Japanese manufacturer. So you were looking at Aprilia as being the only option, and again, there was the sticking point of, was Aprilia going to front up the cash for him? As it turns out, they were not, although subsequently they were then quite happy to stump up the cash for Jorge Martin. So I'd like to, at that point of the year, what way would you have gone if you were Aprilia, Martin or Fabio? I don't know. I think I would have put my chips in the Quartararo basket, obviously, but I don't sign the paychecks at Aprilia, so... I think there was this kind of, if it was Aprilia or nothing, but it was also kind of hard to see him kind of really going anywhere, because Fabio's a great talent, but he's also kind of priced himself out of the market by just being too valuable, really. he's a world champion, so he commands a bigger salary, which is absolutely fair enough. But we now live in this sort of era of sort of almost the post big salary era of MotoGP, which has kind of been dictated by Ducati, and various other, you know, manufacturers making big money signings for riders that have really not panned out, and then they've all gone, oh well, not going to be doing that anymore. Yeah, Fabio was in an unfortunate position there as well. I think Lynn Jarvis deserves a lot of credit for getting that deal over the line and for Yamaha to keep Fabio, because without Fabio, that manufacturer is probably looking at a non-existent future in the Premier class, because I'm sorry, with all due respect, I don't see Alex Rins taking the same step to get to Fabio's level next year, and I certainly don't see a future where Yamaha is going to be spearheaded to the front of the grid by Jack Miller and Miguel Oliveira. You know, Fabio is the only one that makes that manufacturer right now look competent and have a viable future. And, you know, it worked out for Yamaha. Whether it's going to work out for Fabio or not, I guess we'll see over the next couple of years.
It's a very interesting point about the salary curve, because we do sort of exist in a situation that's logical to the outside world, but not so logical to sports, where for the best salary, you have to accept a bad bike. And that makes sense intuitively, right? They pay you more so that you accept the thing that doesn't win. And I would be stunned, for instance, if Quartararo would have accepted Martin's terms, whatever they gave Martin at Aprilia, because Martin was coming from the Ducati structure of the salaries, and Quartararo would have been forfeiting a Yamaha worse contract. Not to mention, obviously, world championship status at that point. One of them had it, the other one didn't. But yeah, we're in a very interesting world right now in that regard, because the guys who are going to pay you a lot, I mean, you have to then put in the work to make the bike good. You know, they're not ready to pay you a lot and give you a bike that's ready to win, which is, you know, it's quite fascinating. It stretches the field, and sometimes in a good way. I think this year kind of in a bad way, I guess, because I think MotoGP would be better off with Fabio on a better bike right now, but maybe longer term it's better off with him on a better Yamaha.
Well, we're speaking of salaries and Aprilia and what it spent or didn't have to spend to get people. We actually got the Aprilia lineup right. The first hint of that was way back in our start of the year predictions for the whole season episode, where Simon just straight away there suggested that Jorge Martin would be leaving Ducati and Aprilia was the most likely destination. When we then came to predict the entire grid, Simon got even more spot on.
I agree with his pick for Jorge Martin.
Wow.
All right.
Okay.
For all the same reasons. I think that he's going to end this year bitter at Ducati not offering him a factory ride, be desperate to get on a factory bike anywhere, and I think the Aprilia is going to present the best option for him, given that the two Japanese manufacturers are going to take a bit of time to close the door, and we've already, you know, basically said that KTM is a super strong lineup. So I think Aprilia will be his best option. I think Aleix Espargaro will help sort of streamline that move, but I think that he'll be the one replacing Aleix, not joining him, because I think Aleix's role as a development rider is going to be super strong, and Aprilia are going to want him to be their test rider for the new bike. I also think that his season this year is not going to be as strong as it looks right now, because that's kind of what Aprilia and Aleix have done for the last few years. They've started the season really strong, and then it falls off a cliff about round 4. And that's with Argentina in the calendar early on, which they don't have this year to make themselves look really good. So, yeah, I don't think Aleix is going to be there. I think Martin's teammate is going to be Marco Bezzecchi.
Okay, this is getting good. What's your logic?
Aprilia want an Italian, first of all. I think that fits. Bezzecchi has already said that he doesn't want to go to Pramac because, you know, the whole point of VR46 is creating factory riders, and there's no point in moving from one satellite Ducati to another. That's the logic he used when he turned it down last season, and I think that logic still applies. And then, you know, if he's not going to do that, if he desperately wants to be a factory rider, where else is he going to go? The Aprilia is the next best fit for him.
So there we go. Absolutely spot on, Simon.
That is the best 3 minutes of MotoGP punditry I've ever given. Like, that's it. I've peaked now. It's done. That is actually pretty much exactly what happened, right?
It is, yeah. And my noise that I made in the background, I think, was indicative of the fact that I don't think we saw an entire Aprilia lineup clear out happening at that point. I did end up endorsing your picks to make the episode interesting, but I think the idea of Espargaro and Viñales going was unlikely in our eyes. And I think we still weren't sure that Aprilia could actually attract that strong a lineup, that enough people would see a works bike that was slower than the satellite Ducatis being appealing, which does bring us on to some of the things we got wrong. So I've got three columns here: oops, quite big oops, and biggest oops. And if any facial expressions look interesting, I have to stop. I'll do it along the way. But on my oops column, so we didn't see Yamaha winning Pramac over. We were talking about VR46 maybe going to Yamaha, but we still felt Ducati would have 8 bikes going into 2025. We thought Digia and Firmenaldigo would end up at Pramac. We thought Ayagura would be on the LCR Honda, but the universe thought Ayagura would be on the LCR Honda at some point. We thought Augusto Fernandez and Jack Miller would hang on at Tech 3 because that just seemed like a sort of KTM thing to happen potentially. We put Celestino Vietti at VR46. Simon tried to get Ayumi Sasaki there as well, which Lewis is just laughing at this now. Moto2 was odd this season, in fairness. Lewis has no words for that.
Sorry, I'm just trying to. That's rude. I'm a guest in your house here, and I'm pissing on the sofa.
Openly mocking me.
Do you know what? I'm sure there was a good reason for the Sasaki thing at the time, the Vietti thing at the time, but I'm struggling to think what they might have been.
I don't know. Look, I object to the Vietti thing and the Sasaki thing being put in the same category.
I mean, it's politics and passports.
Yeah, I can sort of being more serious. I can sort of understand the logic. I mean, for me, I've never looked at Celestino Vietti and seen him as being MotoGP caliber. To be quite honest with you, but again, maybe that's just I'm overly critical and overly harsh.
You feel that way about all but 5 riders, maybe. I would say.
Then you end up in a situation, like some television broadcasters where they just seem to think the sun shines out of every single rider, which is generally not the case. This is top level motorsport. You have to be at a certain level. You have to be the absolute best of the best. You can't just be all right, because then what's the point? That's my sort of position when it comes to that sort of thing.
It's lovely having you here, Lewis. I'm sure the entire MotoGP field agrees. Into the quite big oops column. This is where I'm interested in our thoughts about why people weren't going for satellite Ducatis, even though there are now obviously fewer of them. So we all thought somebody different would end up at Gresini, somebody big, effectively. So we end up picking Joan Mir to go to Gresini. Val, you'd also mooted Maverick Viñales as a potential Gresini candidate. Simon, you thought he might end up at Trackhouse. Even we definitely saw Viñales moving on eventually. But I'm very taken by the fact that a lot of us in the predictions podcast thought people would be trying to get on the Gresini Ducati, seeing it as a way to win races, even though the salary would be lower than being on a manufacturer bike. Has that not turned out to be true across the satellite Ducati lineup because there just aren't enough Ducatis left now, or because people just want to be factory riders too much? Simon, this feels like your turf.
I don't know. I don't know if it's related to the whole pay thing that we've been discussing, whether or not, there are less seats that pay good money now, so people are more likely to cling on to them. And we've also probably got a bit of a weird situation where maybe a few youngsters have won titles earlier than they should have. And I'm looking at Quartararo and Mir, which means they've now got time to try and develop a crap bike before coming back to win titles again, because they've got a title.
Yeah.
And probably quite a large amount of money in the bank because of those titles and because of early successes, although bless him, Joan Mir didn't take home much in win bonuses in his title season. So I wonder if that's what it is, if it's that people are kind of more willing to give the factories a turn, knowing that there's, they're going to get really well paid for it and the factory is eventually going to come good.
Yeah, it's that. I think it's money and it's all the prestige stuff. It's just, accepting a downgrade in status for the betterment of your career is a thing that's easy to predict, I guess, in a podcast setting. Easy to just say, well, that's obviously what he should do. I mean, would John Mir have been happier right now if he was a Gresini Ducati rider? I think so. In a MotoGP context, I don't know, like maybe in his family life he would have had to give up some luxuries, and maybe those luxuries are actually what make him happier than winning MotoGP races. Probably not, but look, I don't know. I'm not going to pretend to know. It's easy to imagine from a purely like rational game theory point of view, and then you actually, you think about it for a second, and they are also all here to do a job, and it's just nice to be a factory rider, isn't it? I mean, I would be a factory podcaster if that was a thing. I'd quite like that.
Is that an option?
It will be,
because like if it is, I will drop you like quicker than Aleix Espargaro dropped an Aprilia test rider contract.
I was just trying to think what team we would be. We certainly don't ever pretend to be slick on this podcast. I was going to say we could even be Pramac, but that's a good thing.
At least we're not KTM.
Also, I should say the Vinales prediction, I think, in light of the Tech 3 KTM move, isn't that bad. But also, it was just wishful thinking. Like I was trying to make it happen through putting it out there. Doesn't work.
Lewis, do you think more people should have taken the prospect of being a bit more competitive on a satellite Ducati more seriously over staying at a manufacturer that may be paying them well right now, may come good in 2027, but is just smashing them up at this point?
I think what would have maybe shifted the balance is if Jorge Martin had stayed put. Yeah, I know was contracted to Ducati, but I think had the world champion been overlooked for world champion contender, ultimate world champion, been overlooked for a factory seat but decided to stay where he was, I think that would have opened the floodgates a bit more for more people to go, okay, this satellite team thing really does work. Because you listen to some of the riders, like Digi has said this, Bez has said the same thing. They say, VR46, it feels like a factory team. People have said Gresini, it feels like a factory. These teams are way more well run now, than they used to be. And kind of the old days when there really was this factory satellite divide. It's I'm not surprised that the Marquez move didn't quite open the door for that, because it was always clear from the outset that that Marc was really using this to rebuild, to springboard into a better factory than he'd just come from. I think in Martin's state, I think it would have tipped the balance, but going on to Val says, would you rather be paid more? Would you rather win? That's the question a lot of them are always asked, and 9 times out of 10 they always go for more money, which as an outsider seems like an odd kind of thing. You're being paid a decent amount anyway. Surely there's got to be a point where you want championships and race wins over factory status and slightly more expensive supercars. Like, what are you going to be remembered for at the end of the day? What cars you bought or what championships you won? It's a weird that that's still the prevailing sense, and a lot of sports, not just MotoGP, but a lot of sports, that they'd rather go for the money than the best, environment to win in. It's a strange one.
Yeah, for me, it's always been two things. One of them's more general. The money, it means the money, right? But at a certain point, you can only buy so much, right? Like for me, some of those salaries going around, I would like to imagine they would make no difference to me in terms of the actual lifestyle and whatnot. Like you just need enough to live comfortably. But when you're super competitive and everybody's your whole life told you how great you are, the money you're being paid is also a big symbol of that, right? What's this manufacturer ready to pay me? What's this satellite team ready to pay me? It shows how much they want me. It shows how much I am valued relative to my peers. I mean, that is why Johan Zarco is an LCR Honda rider right now and not a Ducati satellite rider. So, it's that show of faith, of value. Money is always such a huge part of that. But the second part, and I've not thought about this so much in a MotoGP context, but maybe I should, and maybe we all should. It is also a ticking clock type of situation, right? If you hold out for your big payday and you set up your career to maximize it down the line, to maximize the chances of a title, and to sacrifice some money now for maybe a big payday later, and then you Alex Rins your leg, right? Just you do it at Mugello.
Yeah.
payday's gone. That's it. And you've earned okay, but maybe that's not what you've projected for. That's not what you've budgeted for. That's not how you're living. And suddenly that does impact your life. So at that age with young families and stuff, they just go, all right, we've got to get it now. And then when I'm in the Marc position of forfeiting double-digit millions because I want to win again, well, that's a different dilemma for me. And I don't want to go uber capitalist here, but it's trying to rationalize and to understand it.
I said the biggest oops column exists as well, and that is what we thought Marc Marquez was going to do for 2025. Now, Val mentioned earlier in the episode that there have been predictions of Marquez winning the championship. And this is of Val winning the championship. I don't think we ever got as lairy as predicting that Val would be world champion. He did put himself on a KTM for a long philosophical point in an episode recently. Simon felt Marquez was going to walk the championship when Marquez signed for Gresini Ducati. Then, as testing happened, as Marquez came on this actual podcast and did a one-on-one with Simon and was very open about his doubts about himself at that point, physically as much as anything, it just became clear that this was going to take more time than it seemed. So that was on our minds when we were predicting the 2025 lineups, and it led to a rather strange conclusion.
I think we're going to see him winning races in the Gresini bike, for sure. We're going to see the Honda looking substantially better this season as they slowly but surely make improvements to it. And we're going to get to the end of the year and Marc Marquez is going to decide, you know what, I could win at Sachsenring, Circuit of the Americas and Valencia and Aragon on a Repsol Honda if I can do it in a Gresini Ducati that's a year old, because their bike looks a bit better and it's not trying to kill the riders every weekend. I might as well go back there and earn 20 million euros doing it instead of earning 250,000 euros at Gresini. I think that it's either he's going to end this season so strongly that he's going to think I could win on that Honda even though it's going to get a bit better, or he's going to end this season thinking I don't know if I can win anymore, so I might as well not do that and get paid 10 times as much money.
So, Val, your thoughts listening back to our Simon's confidence, and we actually endorsed it.
You cannot imagine my relief, because I knew what was coming up, and I was really worried there was going to be my voice. When it was Simon's voice, I felt relief just wash over me, because I know I felt the same way, and I'm going to find the best excuse possible. I'm going to find a completely different culprit who's not any of us for this theory and for why it failed. It's Ducati. Ducati's to blame. Here's why Ducati is to blame. Ducati is to blame because Ducati does not act like we've been conditioned to believe dominant teams act. Ducati doesn't do things that we've been conditioned to think it does. I remember there was a lot of feeling that Enea Bastianini will keep his seat, for instance.
Yeah.
Why would he keep his seat? Because why does Ducati need another number one? Why does Ducati need a rider who also might win the championship if it already has a rider who is clearly very capable of doing that and will do that with a bike advantage that exists? But Ducati just hasn't bought into that paradigm of do just enough to minimize friction and to win the title you're going to win anyway. Ducati has gone for the show and the marketing, and we didn't. I mean, it took me a while to see that coming, because I think early in the season when we were looking at the dynamic, Marc was a fox in the henhouse who nobody invited, and it was almost like a rogue move by Gresini to bring him into the Ducati camp, and everybody else at Ducati just had to go, yeah, fine, whatever. And then it became gradually clearer and clearer that actually, not only does Gigi Dall'Igna quite love this and have a lot of power, but he would actually quite love this on the works bike too.
Yeah, even as it was unfolding and it got to that weekend and it had been a growing possibility, I still felt a degree of, this is really happening? Seriously? As those announcements started dropping and it became obvious that Marquez to factory Ducati really was going to happen. For that reason that you suggest, Val, that you just thought Ducati doesn't need this headache. Ducati's got a champion. Lewis, obviously you weren't on this podcast back then. Was there any part of you going into 2024 thinking, yeah, it's a one season flit for Marquez on Ducati. He'll be back on a Honda in 2025. That Honda's going to do just fine.
There was a brief thought in my mind. I'm pretty sure me and Simon might have even mentioned this in Valencia at the time during the test in kind of floated the idea that if, the Honda had started off really well, if it kind of gets to a point where, Marc's had a big comeback, the Honda's back to where it needs to be, and he's like, okay, I'll go back. There was a little brief time when I thought that was going to happen. As the first few races played out, I still wasn't really sure as to what way it was going to go with Marc for 25. I think the biggest sort of surprise about the whole thing, kind of looking back now, is Ducati's naivety. In what universe did they think he was ever going to go to Pramac willingly? As he said at the time, everyone was kind of taken by surprise that he was so publicly like, no, I'm not going to Pramac. It's either a factory team or a factory bike at Gresini. Why then Ducati dug its heels in and said, no, it's either that or nothing, when they could have had a situation where they could have had all three and kept Marc happy? I'm not really sure why Ducati naively thought it could kind of have its cake and eat it. Obviously, the fact that Marc threw his weight around caused a bit of a stir. Showed how much power he still has, and that's something that Claudio Domenicali's seen and gone, I don't really care what happens in my structure if I've got that rider on my factory bike, to hell with everyone else. I think that it kind of showed a little bit that the balance of power and the way it's structured in Ducati is a bit off, because you look at that and you go, there's no way Marc was ever going to go to Pramac, really. Why would he go to Pramac? And accept that Martin was going to be promoted. If he was going to stay at Satellite Team, he'd stay where he was and get a factory bike, because he loved that team. He loved the team, he loved the surrounding. I think, the naivety of Ducati, but that's something we've seen before with Ducati, that they have genuinely been a fairly naive manufacturer over the years, expecting things to work out in certain ways that kind of sort of just defy logic. You think back to the whole getting rid of Lorenzo and then trying to tempt him back at the expense of Jack Miller, halfway through to the 19, you think, you signed this guy to a big money contract, you didn't give him any time to adapt, and now you're running around trying to bring him back. How has that been allowed to happen? That's going to be the interesting thing for me going into next year as well. Is that power dynamic with Marc in there upsetting the whole order? There's clearly some facets of management that were very, very keen for him to be there, others that probably from the outset weren't. Ducati's naivety might be the thing that comes back to bite them really quite hard over the next couple of years.
For me, the surprise was even the idea of Marc staying a further year on a satellite bike, even though obviously he's publicly confirmed that was going to be okay. But even the idea of that a year ago, I was just like, no, obviously this Gresini thing is a 1-year deal. Obviously, because it happened by necessity, and it's the biggest rider in the sport. He will find himself a works bike for next year, whether it's a rejuvenated Honda, whether it's KTM that definitely has a lot of money, whether it's somebody else. It was obviously surely happening. And honestly, I guess we did come pretty close to Marc still being a satellite rider, which, it's hard for me to imagine. It happened for a full year this year, and it still doesn't really click in my head as an idea.
As much as I love the storyline of Marc and Pecco in the same garage, I still think Pecco and Jorge Martin in factory Ducati and Gresini getting the 2025 bike and keeping Marc would have just been almost as good. You wouldn't have had the Marquez in factory red, and seeing that the first test was a little bit like, oh no, this is something a bit special, but I think for an ongoing storyline that would have had so much potential. Interestingly, we obviously had a lot of faith in Honda doing better. Now, in the first episode of 2024, one of my questions for you two to predict was around who would benefit most from concessions. I'm not even going to go there because the answer was nobody. Everybody on concessions scored fewer points in 2024 than 2023. Yamaha's progress was something of a bone of contention. So I'm going to play various things that the three of you said at different times, and the optimism level varies slightly across this one. So we started in the January the 1st episode with Simon picking Yamaha as who he thought would have a much better season.
I actually think that we're going to see Yamaha looking quite a bit stronger this year. There we go. I did it in the first answer. This year. Yamaha they've been building into something. 2023 looked like a complete disaster mainly because they didn't win anything. But I think whenever you look behind the scenes, they weren't actually that far away. And we know exactly where they're struggling. We know where the weakness of the bike is. It's this, immediate corner acceleration issue where they're not able to get up to speed, and then they're conceding a ton of speed in a straight line because of it. So it's something that in theory is fixable. It's something that Yamaha know how to fix. And we're going into a new season now where they've suddenly got a massive advantage in this area specifically because of the new concessions. So it means that they can tinker with their aerodynamics. It means they can tinker with their engine specification during the season. It means that they can test all those things with the race riders. And on top of that, it also means that, they can now go and not only test with their racers, they've got a new racer to test with. They've got Alex Rins coming into the team, who is, I think everyone is expecting him to be super strong, super competitive. He knows how to ride an inline 4 MotoGP bike really, really quickly because he's won races at Suzuki.
So that was a bit of Yamaha optimism at the start of the year. And then Lewis turned up in the middle of the season, a season in which Yamaha was rubbish up to that point, and said this.
I think this one will probably be quite a low-scoring one, but I'll try and defend it as best I can. I think we will see, if not on the top step of the podium, there will be a point this season where we see Fabio Quartararo on that Yamaha have a really good challenge for a race win.
Yep, that dated well. Val responded to that in quite a strong way.
No way.
I don't want to be overly negative, and I hear the prediction about Yamaha winning this season. I think the world's geopolitical situation is unstable enough to where all the other bikes could get impounded on the way to the racetrack, and then the Yamahas show up and they probably finish 1, but not 2 because Alex Rins didn't make the checkered flag. Look, fool me once, shame on me. Oh, shame on you. Wow, I messed that up. Fool me once, shame on you. Fool me twice, whatever. Fool me 15 million times, etc. The Yamaha has shown nothing to me. I think Fabio Quartararo is having a tangibly better season than last season. I think he's riding out of his mind. And all the M1 can give him is 12th place finishes. I think it is shameful. I think they've not done anything to make me go, oh, this is going somewhere. I have never been less impressed with anything than I am with the Yamaha this season, except for maybe the Honda this season, which is somehow less impressive. And their clock is running out. There's only, 2.5 years to fix this before everything gets thrown in the bin and we redo the regulations from scratch? No, I'm not on board with this.
That is so fairly forthright from Val. So 4 months on from that disparity in views, let's revisit Lewis's thoughts first that Yamaha might win a race or become very close to it by the end of the season. How do you feel about that now?
Well, it was always that was the whole point. It was a lairy prediction, so I went for a lairy prediction. I think I still sort of fundamentally believe there was enough signs coming from the Yamaha project that a rider like Fabio would find a situation, whether it be a funny low grip one like Indonesia, like we saw last season with the podium, a wet rate. The Yamaha has generally performed quite well when it's been properly tipping it down. And to be fair, I'm not saying it would have been the case, but I think that Thailand race would have been a lot better. Not been nerfed by Franco Morbidelli.
Yeah.
I think there was opportunities there where we could have seen something a bit better and didn't quite go his way. But there was generally some flashes of speed where clearly they're taking a step forward. And if you listen to actually what Fabio's been saying, like he's there's still more work to be done, but he's happy with the kind of change that has been done within Yamaha. So I think there is tangibly progress. Was it ever good? Is it enough to hit the ground running next year and start fighting for race wins? Probably not. But that's not really the target right now, I don't think. I stand by that there could have been a really good result in the off. I mean, I think if Johan Zarco could get the Honda into top 8s, at that point of the season, Quartararo with some slightly better kind of fortune under him probably could have done a bit better than that.
Val, do you still regard Yamaha as the least impressive thing that you've experienced in your life, or however you phrased it?
Yes. Yeah, of course. But I should say, I think even if I remember correctly in that episode, I did basically sort of concur with Lewis at that point that if, because the big problem is in qualifying. So if Fabio on the right track, gets himself in the right position early into the race, and probably being a sprinter or whatever, and anything's possible. It just didn't quite happen. They kept not qualifying quite well enough. The qualifying gap is still like a chasm. Even getting into Q2, you end up like 9/10 off pole. You can't win from there. You can't challenge from wins from there unless you have much more in the race. And it feels like they still have the same problem that first alarmed them. So would it have been 2 years ago or 1.5 years ago? I don't know. But it feels like we've been talking about a Yamaha that can run race pace but can't qualify for a considerable amount of time now, and that is quite dispiriting. I think they did improve a bit at the end of the season. That was never my point, because fair enough, and it's good and it is impressive, and I credit to them for not giving up on this set of regulations and just not full focus on 27. Credit to them for not giving up on Fabio, but a manufacturer of that stature, of that history, going from finishing 12th to finishing 8th still will not do a ton for me. I'm being a little bit hyperbolic and theatrical about that kind of stuff, but I don't want to praise them for ticking a box. I will praise them when they're winning again.
Yeah, Simon, you've dropped in a lot of stuff through the season about how you feel Yamaha is getting better than its results curve is actually showing. You also made, at the time, a persuasive case for Honda getting better enough for Marquez to think about it seriously for 2025. Someone who is, for instance, only following TV coverage of MotoGP that shows the top 2 riders and basically nobody else, would have not noticed Yamaha or Honda doing anything much whatsoever during 2024. But you're fairly adamant that Yamaha in particular is not just making moves for the future, but is actually showing gains that you can see at the moment? Or is this more about, look at it 8 months down the line when the V4's here, when Bartolini's full effect is in place?
I think I stand by pretty much everything I said about Yamaha. I think they had a fairly decent second half to the season, where Quartararo was kind of semi-regularly challenging for like top 6s again, running out of fuel a lot, maybe not always seeing the checkered flag in 5th or 6th, but there was real definite signs of improvement there. I think he definitely, they upped the game. We haven't seen the full fruits of it yet. There's still work to be done, but I'm more confident than ever that, it goes back to what we said at the very beginning about Fabio staying there. The whole path to that decision I can see, from the improving bike to everything they're doing for him. It's all part of the same puzzle, and it is all coming together. On the Honda front, it's harder to see improvements, but all you have to do for me is to look at the championship standings and realize that, like, for the first 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, for the first 9 races of the year, Luca Marini didn't score a point, and then basically consistently scored points for the last 9 races of the year. So there is improvements coming across the board. Things are getting better for both the Japanese manufacturers, even if, like you say, Matt, the wonderful MotoGP TV coverage isn't necessarily going to highlight that whenever the cameras are focused on first, second, and Marc Marquez.
I should say, I do think Honda improved, but it is also important to always offset that against the Aprilias collectively catching fire in the second half of the season and KTM giving up on 2 of its riders, which I think happened.
I would also argue that without Zarco, the Honda situation is way worse than it is, because I worked out that Zarco scored about 44 of Honda's 75 Constructors' Championship points this year. So
it's actually less than I would have expected, honestly.
If you look at the chasm that was there already between them, you remove Zarco from that equation, and you've got, probably Honda looking way worse than they maybe do right now.
Yeah, if I mentioned the Quartararo interview that is in the Members Club being well worth a listen. Zarco is great value on what's going on at Honda, and on so many parallels he draws to his failed KTM stint with what he's trying to do now. Joan Mir is a slightly depressing listen at times, but he's certainly heartfelt in talking about how desperate he is to succeed with Honda and why he stayed put. And Luca Marini is just basically giving us a great engineering debrief about everything that goes on at Honda with his engineer's brain. Interestingly, like you say, Zarco made Honda look great. Marini, I know, like you say, Simon, he went from not scoring to scoring, but He went from just embarrassingly slow, I know for a kind of, I'm sussing the bike, I'm not prepared to crash it yet reason, to respectable-ish. It wasn't like a huge, brilliant, this is progress leap, but we can agree to disagree on Honda and Yamaha's progress for a good 12, 24 months, yeah, I'm sure. Something else we ended up agreeing to disagree on, and most of our picks for these predictions to revisit have been like big themes, rider moves, manufacturers making progress or not making progress, championship outcomes. Here's one about someone who was underwhelming us actually turning around and winning a race or not. So this is one of Simon's predictions. And as he said at the time, this was during the August episode, he threw in 2 here. One, yeah, fair enough, and one drew a little gasp from us.
So half of this prediction is not going to be that Larry, and it's something we've already discussed. But the other half of it is going to be slightly more Larry, but I'm fine with that. Pedro Acosta is going to win a race this season, and so is Franco Morbidelli.
Why? What's so funny? No, I mean...
Thank you, Val. Thank you.
Yes, so your defence there, Simon, and... you were lambasted a little bit on the top 10 riders ranking podcast as well for putting Morbidelli in your top 10, and the rest of us were like, seriously? We did that episode during the summer break, and Morbidelli had looked stronger around kind of Mugello, Assen, Sachsenring time. So I'm not going to say what on earth were you thinking, because he wasn't a GP24, he was riding for Pramac. I could see what you were thinking. But not only did it not happen, it never actually looked like it was going to happen. He appeared in the top 3 early in races quite often, but didn't even get a podium. I know in the top 10 riders episode you said, don't underestimate the severity of the head injury pre-season and stuff, but why did he get to a point where just as it seemed that he'd got on top of this bike and things were going to start working, it still just didn't happen? He still just drifted away again.
I mean, arguably, he should have been a consistent podium finisher for the second half of the season. If Marc Marquez had done the same thing as everyone else in the GP23 and struggled. Because he was kind of right on the verge of being, knocking on the door of podiums every weekend. And then another Ducati jumped in front of him and just demoted him one. But I don't think the second half of the season was bad in the context of how ridiculously close MotoGP is right now, and how losing all of your preseason testing and spending the first half of the year recovering from a traumatic brain injury, sort of didn't your start to the year. I genuinely thought there would be opportunities where he would be able to surprise us with a win, but nonetheless win. And as for Pedro Acosta, he should have won things. He just threw it away.
Yeah, agreed on that front. Lewis, you've reminded us in this podcast that you're famously tolerant and love riders having reasons for underperformance. Do you think Franco Morbidelli had a good second half of the season?
It was better than the first half of the season, but that's about as much as I can say. But I think the rider that Franco Morbidelli that won races a few years ago on a satellite Yamaha is gone. I don't think that's just a this year thing. I think it's been a steady decline for a while. I just don't think he's up to it now. I don't think in this ever changing landscape, with things are getting more competitive. You've got more guys stepping up. You've got young guys coming up all the time who are making quite big impact straight away. I just don't really see a situation where Franco Morbidelli's a race winner anymore. I expected at least some more. Because I'm pretty sure in that podcast I said as well that I thought Morbidelli was a better rider than Zarco. Sitting here right now, I completely 100% reverse that. I think Zarco is the much better rider now. I just think Morbidelli on a GP24, if Bastianini could get up there and get into the podium fight and, semi-occasionally challenge for a win, pre-season stuff aside from Morbidelli, there kind of comes to a point where you have to go, okay, you've 2 races a weekend, there's a lot of track time now. You kind of should be up there a bit more. If not getting on the podium, then at least finishing 4th every weekend. And he wasn't even doing that, even with Marc, kind of up and down with various things. I like Franco a lot, and I want him to do well, and I want to try and sit here and defend him, but I can't anymore. I think he hasn't justified really even enough to stay on the grid next year. He's very lucky that there is a VR46 team out there right now.
So I remember in Barcelona, and I mean Solidarity Barcelona, not Catalan GP Barcelona. Somebody asked him.
Solid.
Yeah. Somebody asked him. Lewis made a ridiculous gesture. Anyway, somebody asked Franco, if not for the preseason injury, if that didn't happen, where do you think you would have finished the season? And it's a high risk, high reward question, because it's a question where the rider might look at you and go, how should I know? Why would you ask something like this? Or it's if they do answer, then it suddenly tells you a ton. And Franco Morbidelli, to his credit, did answer. He said 5th, probably would have been fighting for 5th, not 4th, not 3rd, not 2nd, not 1st. So let's say 5th, behind obviously the other GP24s and behind the phenomenon that is Marc Marquez. And that's, to me, that does make me wonder, not just because he said it, but also because of what we've seen this season. You know, he might have been catching up in the first half, and this might be the level. This might be what he's got on that bike. And if so, it's not embarrassing. It's not like horrific. It's not terrible, but it's not. I don't know what comes after then. I don't know. It's hard to formulate what exactly I'm trying to say, right? But just the thinking of this might be the level, and if this is the level, then where do we go from here? And I'm afraid the answer is we don't go terribly far.
Yeah, it's a level that's not like it's offensive that you're in MotoGP, but it's like if there's a more pressing candidate for your seat, they don't have to do too much to edge you out of it. In theory, thank you for being up for the potential embarrassment of reliving everything we predicted would happen in the impossibility of predicting modern life and sport. Lewis, thank you for coming back. For the potential to kind of just be laughed at as well. We do appreciate you giving up your time for that.
I get laughed at. It's just my entire existence. I get laughed at home all the time. I'm used to it.
Me too, Lewis. Me too. Sometimes your other half and my other half team up to laugh at us.
Oh yeah,
this is the reality.
And then they come on podcasts to then laugh at me also, so it's just ridiculous. It's no winning.
Well, without wanting to give your partners more reasons to laugh at you, I should add that we did hold back on replaying a couple of predictions in this episode because they related to years beyond 2024. One of which, and this was you, I think, Simon, was a suggestion that Pecco Bagnaia would be on the Aprilia by 2027. And also, there was this 2026 championship prediction.
Costa's going to win the 2026 World Championship.
There you go. That's a proper.
No one's going to remember my Larry prediction by then.
And that's the problem, Simon. Some people do, or we turn them into whole episodes. Thank you, listeners, for your patience and your support during this season. It's been fantastic having you along for the ride with us in both the main feed and the Members Club. We really, really appreciate all the support, all the interaction, all the ideas. MotoGP is fantastic. Even when it's not as good as it could and should be, it is still absolutely brilliant. It is so much fun doing this podcast and having you all along with us. We really, really appreciate the hours you put in to listening to us, coming up with Larry predictions, arguing with each other and everything else. We're back early in the new year with more of that. Have a fantastic Christmas.
The Athletic.